He lost his wife in childbirth, and his baby was starving until a stranger knocked on his door and said, "Let me feed her." That one sentence would shatter the silence of his grief and set in motion a love neither of them dared to imagine. Montana Territory, 1881. The last snow of winter clung to the hills like ash after a fire. Inside a weathered log cabin, Samuel Wade rocked his infant daughter against his chest, her cries thin and fading. His wife, Ruth, had died 6 weeks earlier, leaving him with a life too small to save, and a house filled with echoes. He had tried everything warm: goat's milk, sugar, water, even desperate prayers whispered to a God who no longer answered. Nothing kept the child alive. The fire had burned down to embers, the room heavy with cold and silence. In the doorway, his last act of hope fluttered in the wind. A note nailed to the wood: "If anyone can feed my child, God will bless you forever." Hours later, as thunder rolled through the valley, someone knocked. A young woman stood there, her hair soaked, her breath trembling in the cold. "My name's Clara," she said softly. "I heard the crying from my farm. If you'll allow it, I can nurse her." And in that frozen moment, Samuel didn't yet know it, but the offer from a stranger's lips would soon bind them through mercy, rumor, and love that neither heart was ready to face. The wind that swept across the Montana plains carried more than snow, it carried silence. The kind that pressed against a man's chest until even breathing felt like guilt. Samuel Wade's cabin stood alone at the edge of a frozen creek, its roof patched with tar and prayer. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and uncertain, vanishing into the gray sky before it could be seen from town. Inside, the walls bore the scars of winter and memory alike. A broken cradle leaned near the hearth, and a single woman's shawl, Ruth's, hung by the door, stiff with dust. The smell of pine smoke mingled with something sweeter, the faint trace of baby's milk warming over the fire. Samuel moved through the small room with the slow caution of a man afraid to wake ghosts. Every sound felt louder than it should: the crack of the fire, the weak gasp of his daughter, the storm groaning through the rafters. The world outside was a field of white and loss. When the knock came, it seemed at first like the house itself had spoken. Samuel froze, heart pounding, unsure whether to answer or to hide. Then came the voice, a woman's, soft but certain, cutting through the storm. "Sir," she called, "please, I can help." And there she stood on the porch, Clara Hensley, a widow from the next valley, her cloak soaked, her cheeks raw from the wind. Behind her, the night howled. Before her, a starving child whimpered. The space between them was a single breath, and a decision that would change everything. For a long moment, Samuel didn't move. The storm hissed behind her like a living thing, filling the silence between them. Clara stood on the porch, her hands clutching her cloak tight at the neck, her boots caked in mud and snow. The lantern from the window painted her face in trembling gold. She looked frightened but resolute. "I heard her crying," she said, voice catching. "All night, I heard her." Samuel's throat tightened. "She won't drink," he managed. "I've tried everything." "There." Clara took a hesitant step forward. "If you'll let me, I can try." The words hung in the air like something sacred. It wasn't a command, nor an intrusion, just a plea between two broken hearts. Samuel stared at her, at the way the wind clung to her hair, the way her eyes softened when they met his. She was no stranger, not truly. He remembered seeing her once at the market before the snow came, her laughter faint, her wedding ring dull from wear. Now she stood before him, offering not pity, but something rarer, help that might cost her reputation. He looked down at the baby in his arms, tiny and trembling. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. Clara entered, and the door shut behind her with a sigh. The cabin, once filled only with grief, seemed to exhale warmth again. For the first time in weeks, Samuel felt something he hadn't dared to feel since Ruth's grave froze solid hope. Clara's hands trembled as she stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a memory she wasn't ready for. Steam curled from the pot above the hearth. The smell of smoke and milk mingled with the faint scent of cedar and grief. Samuel stood behind her, silent. He looked older than his 30 years, his beard uneven, eyes hollow, the weight of sleepless nights pressing into the lines around his mouth. His hands were large, rough, yet they held the infant with astonishing gentleness. Clara knelt beside the fire. "She's so small," she whispered. "She was born early," Samuel said quietly. "Ruth didn't." His voice cracked. He turned away. Clara nodded once. No more needed saying. She unbuttoned the top of her coat, revealing a dress too thin for the cold. Samuel hesitated, unsure where to look. "I only want to help," she said softly. He handed her the baby as if handing over his last prayer. Clara held the child close, humming under her breath. The sound, warm, human, alive, seemed to steady the cabin itself. When the infant began to feed, the room fell silent, except for the faint rhythm of rain against the roof and the small, wet breaths of life returning. Samuel turned away, shoulders shaking once. Clara didn't speak. She just held the baby until her cries turned to sighs and sleep. When she looked up again, the firelight caught Samuel's eyes. "She's strong," Clara murmured. "She just needed someone to see her as worth saving." Samuel managed a whisper. "Thank you." That night, he offered her the spare room, the small space off the kitchen that had once stored tools and saddles. She refused at first. "I'll be gone by morning," she said, clutching her shawl. But the storm outside raged like judgment, slamming at the shutters. "You'll freeze before sunrise," Samuel said, his tone flat but kind. "Stay." And she did. She slept on the cot with her coat still on, the baby's soft cries drifting through the walls. Samuel stayed awake by the hearth, watching the flames fight the wind. The storm howled until dawn, but inside, the sound of life, tiny breaths, steady now, was enough to keep him warm. By morning, the sky had cleared, pale and cold as tin. Clara woke first, feeding the baby by the light of the fire. Samuel stirred, the smell of coffee and pine bark tea filling the room. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. "I know." She smiled faintly. "But she needed me." Samuel looked down at the floorboards. "So did I." For days that turned to weeks, Clara remained. She swept the floors, boiled the milk when needed, and sang softly while mending torn linens. Samuel worked outside mending fences, fixing the barn roof, always silent, always near. When he returned each evening, the cabin glowed with lamplight and the faint sound of a lullaby. Lily, his daughter, had grown stronger, her cheeks pink again, her fists curling with life. And each night, after the baby slept, Samuel and Clara sat across from each other by the fire. Words came slow at first. She told him about her small homestead in the valley below, the crops that failed after her husband's death, the loneliness that followed. "I used to think silence meant peace," she said once. "Now I know it just means no one's left to talk." Samuel nodded. "Out here, silence'll either heal you or kill you. You learn which, one day at a time." By the second week, Clara had stopped saying she would leave. Her belongings, a comb, a tin mug, a folded shawl, remained on the small table by her bed. She woke early, often before dawn, to stoke the fire and warm milk for Lily. Sometimes Samuel caught himself watching her, not out of desire, but out of awe that anyone could bring such calm to a house built on loss. Yet even as peace grew between them, the world outside began to notice. One afternoon, while Samuel traded grain at the mercantile, he heard the whispers. "She's living with him, they say," one woman muttered over a sack of flour, "feeding that child like it's her own. Disgraceful. Poor Ruth, barely cold in the ground," another hissed. "And now this widow taking her place? Shameful." Samuel's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Words wouldn't change a thing. But when he rode home that evening, he saw Clara by the porch, brushing Lily's blanket dry in the Sunday. Her hair glowed gold in the late light, her laughter soft as the wind. For a moment, he forgot the world entirely. Then he remembered, and guilt stung sharper than the cold. That night, he found her sitting by the fire, quiet, distant. "Someone spoke to you," he said. She nodded, not looking up. "They said I'd gone mad. That no decent woman gives herself to another man's house, unless she's after his name." Samuel's hands clenched around his cup. "You did nothing wrong. They don't care about right or wrong, they care about stories." He looked at her for a long moment. "Let them talk." Clara smiled sadly. "It's not their tongues I fear. It's what those words do to the little one when she grows. What if she hears that her first breath came from scandal?" Samuel stared at the fire. "Then she'll hear the truth from me." But the truth had a way of twisting itself when left in other people's mouths. Within days, the rumors spread. 2 ranch hands from a neighboring field laughed loud enough for Clara to hear as they rode past the gate. "Guess he's got his hands full in there," one jeered. "Man loses a wife, finds himself a wet nurse with warm hands. Ain't nature kind?" Clara froze on the porch, her face drained of color. Samuel stepped outside just as the riders disappeared over the hill. He didn't shout, didn't curse, just picked up his hat and went back inside, jaw set tight. Later that night, he found her sitting by Lily's cradle, tears streaking her cheeks. "They'll never stop," she whispered, "and I'll never be anything but the woman who fed your child." Samuel knelt beside her. "You're the woman who saved her," he said softly. "Don't let them take that away." "Ju?" But even as he spoke, Clara's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the dark beyond it, the world waiting to remind her she didn't belong. The next night, the storm returned. Cold rain swept across the plains, turning the earth to mud. Samuel slept lightly, the rifle propped by the door. Sometime past midnight, the wind rose high enough to shake the shutters, and when he opened his eyes, the house was too still. "Clara?" he called. No answer. He rose, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots. The cradle was empty, the quilt gone. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet. He found footprints near the porch, small, hurried, fading toward the barn, his chest clenched. "Clara!" he shouted into the dark. The wind swallowed his voice. He saddled his horse bareback and rode into the storm. Snow blinded him, slicing his face like glass. Each breath burned his lungs, but he pressed on. He couldn't lose them, not again. Near the edge of the property, a dim flicker caught his eye, the light of a lantern, weak and trembling. He dismounted, stumbling through drifts toward the old lumber shed. Inside, he found her. Clara sat curled in the corner, soaked, shivering, Lily wrapped in her arms. The baby's cries were faint now, nearly gone. "Clara," he said, dropping to his knees beside her. "What are you doing? You'll freeze out here." Her lips trembled. "I thought maybe I shouldn't stay." "They're right, Samuel. She isn't mine. Maybe she shouldn't drink from me anymore." Samuel's voice broke as he pulled his coat around both of them. "You didn't take her from me, you gave her back to me." Her breath hitched. She looked up, tears freezing against her skin. "Then why does it still hurt?" He didn't answer. He just held her closer, his arms a shield against the storm. The wind howled outside, but within that small, cold shed, there was only warmth, the kind that comes from 2 broken souls who realize they no longer want to break alone. When dawn came, the storm had passed. Snow blanketed the field like a shroud of forgiveness. Samuel led them back to the cabin, his arm around Clara as she cradled the sleeping child. That morning, he lit the fire higher than ever before. Clara watched as the room filled with light, melting the frost from the window. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "Both of you." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I never wanted to leave." "I know." "One." In that fragile silence, something changed, not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of one. For weeks after, no one dared speak of the rumors again. Samuel rode to town less often, and when he did, the way he looked at people silenced their tongues before they could wag. By spring, the hills turned green again, and wildflowers crept through the thawing snow. Lily learned to smile. Clara learned to laugh again. One morning Samuel found her in the garden, sleeves rolled up, sun on her face. "She's growing fast," he said. "She's loved," Clara replied. He paused. "You ever think about staying? For good, I mean." Clara's smile faltered. "And what would the town say then?" He met her gaze. "Let them talk. I've heard worse, but I won't let them write the ending for us." The wind carried the smell of pine and earth between them. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was full. That night, Clara tucked Lily into her cradle and lingered by the fire. Samuel sat across from her, his eyes on the flames. "Do you ever wonder why God brings certain people together?" she asked quietly. Samuel nodded. "Because he knows what'll keep them alive." Clara smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's all we're meant to do, keep each other alive." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since Ruth's death, he didn't see loss when he saw a woman. He saw life. Outside, The snow melted in slow drips from the eaves. Inside, warmth finally felt like home again. Spring came slow to the Montana hills. The snow melted into long silver rivers that carved the valley in half, carrying away the last traces of winter and the peace Samuel and Clara had found. It began with the dust. One morning, Clara was kneeling by the porch steps with Lily on her lap when she saw it, a rising cloud far down the southern trail. 4 riders, their coats dark, their silhouettes sharp against the Sunday. She blinked, her breath caught. Something in the way they rode purposeful, heavy, felt wrong. Samuel stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw it too, his jaw tightened. "Stay inside," he said. Clara hesitated. "Who are they?" He didn't answer. "Just go." She obeyed, clutching Lily close, heart hammering as she shut the door behind her. The riders stopped at the gate. The lead man was older, thick-shouldered, a leather ledger strapped to his saddle. His voice carried across the yard like thunder. "Samuel Wade." Samuel didn't move. "That's me." The man flipped open the ledger. "Name's Cole Barrett, representing the Wyoming Land and Credit Bureau. Seems your late wife, Ruth Wade, took a loan against this property 2 years before her passing $500 at 10% interest." Samuel's eyes hardened. "I know about the note." "Then you know it's unpaid," Barrett said, "and now it's ours to collect." The other riders dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. One of them spat into the dirt. "This place'll fetch a fair price once it's cleared." Samuel's hand brushed against the handle of the hatchet, stuck in the chopping block. "You'll get nothing from this land." Barrett smirked. "That so? Then I reckon we'll take what's owed by force." Inside, Clara pressed her ear to the door, heart racing. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught the tone, the cold sharpness of men who'd done this before. Lily whimpered in her arms. She hushed her softly, but her eyes filled with fear. Outside, the men spread out, circling the yard. Samuel took one step forward. "You touch a single board on this house, and I swear you'll regret it." Barrett laughed. "You think you can scare me with a woodcutter's tool?" He gestured to one of his men. "Search the barn. See if there's anything worth hauling." The man started toward the barn, but Samuel moved faster. The hatchet hit the post beside the man's head with a solid thunk. The man froze. Barrett's smile faded. "I don't want blood on my hands," Samuel said quietly. "But I'll bury it here if I have to." Clara burst through the door then, unable to stay still any longer. "Stop!" she cried. The wind caught her hair, the baby's cries breaking the standoff. "Please, don't do this. There's a child here." Barrett turned, his gaze raking over her. "So the rumors are true," he sneered. "The widow living with him, raising another woman's babe. How proper." Color drained from her face, but she stood tall. "Say what you want about me, but this land feeds that baby. If you take it, you'll kill her." "That." Barrett laughed, harsh and hollow. "Maybe she should have had better parents." Samuel moved before he thought. His fist connected with Barrett's jaw. The man stumbled back, spitting blood. One of the riders drew his gun. The hammer clicked. "Don't," Samuel said, voice low and steady. "You'll fire that shot, and you'll never make it off my land alive." For a moment, no one breathed. Then Barrett lifted his hand, signaling his men to stand down. "You've got a temper, mister." "Wade," he said, wiping his mouth. "So let's settle this civil. You've got until harvest to pay. Sell your crops, sell your soul, I don't care. But if I don't see that money by first snow, this place and everyone in it belongs to me." He mounted his horse, glaring down. "Don't make me come back." The men turned and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the valley. When the last echo disappeared, Clara exhaled a shaky breath. "Harvest," she whispered. "That's months away. We barely have seed left." Samuel rubbed his face. "Then I'll make the land give what it owes." "You can't do that alone." He looked at her, eyes burning with quiet defiance. "I'm not alone anymore." The months that followed tested them more than any winter before. Samuel worked from dawn to dark, breaking new ground, planting corn and barley on fields still heavy with frost. Clara mended tools, cooked, and nursed the baby between tasks. Her hands blistered, her back ached, but she never complained. At night, they spoke little, too tired for words, but sometimes, when the lamp burned low and Lily slept, Samuel would glance at her across the table and almost smile. By midsummer, the crops stood tall. The air smelled of rain and soil, and for a while, hope returned. But hope, like weather, can turn fast on the plains. Late August brought the drought. The river shrank to a trickle. The ground cracked beneath their boots, and the sky burned white day after day. The corn leaves curled, the barley heads drooped, and Samuel's face grew harder with each passing dawn. Clara found him one evening kneeling in the field, dirt on his hands, sweat streaking his temples. "Samuel," she said softly, "you can't fight the sky." He looked up, voice raw. "If I don't, we lose everything." She knelt beside him. "Not everything." He turned toward her, eyes hollow. "You and Lily deserve more than a man who can't even keep the soil alive." "Don't you dare," she whispered, gripping his arm. "You gave her life when everyone else turned away. You gave me a reason to keep breathing. That's worth more than land." For a moment, they just looked at each other, the dying light stretching between them. Then, as if pulled by something larger than will, he leaned forward. Their foreheads touched, simple, wordless, human. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. But it was the promise of one. 2 weeks later, the rain came. Not gently, but in sheets, drenching the valley. Samuel stood in the doorway, laughing like a man reborn. Clara ran into the yard, the downpour soaking her dress, her hair plastered against her cheeks. She spun, arms wide, and he thought he'd never seen anything so alive. By harvest, the fields glowed gold beneath the sunday. The yield was strong, miraculously so. They worked side by side for days, filling the wagon with grain until their hands bled and their bodies trembled. When the last bundle was tied, Samuel sat beside her on the porch. The child slept between them, the sound of crickets humming in the dusk. "You did it," Clara whispered. "We did it," he almost said, but the words caught in his throat. At the season's end, Barrett returned. This time, he came alone, riding slow, eyes sharp. Samuel waited for him by the gate, the ledger already in his hand. 200 bushels of barley, Samuel said. "Half yours, as agreed." Barrett dismounted, running his hand through the grain. "You pulled this off?" "Hard work and weather," Samuel replied. Barrett studied him, then glanced toward the house. Clara stood in the doorway with Lily in her arms. "Fine," Barrett said, slamming the ledger shut. "Debt's cleared. But mark my words, Wade people don't forget. You and your," he sneered, "lady farmer will never be welcome in town again." Samuel's stare was steady. "Then we'll build our own." Barrett smirked, spat, and rode off without another word. When the dust settled, Clara stepped down from the porch. "It's over. It's over." She nodded, eyes wet. "Then maybe we can stop surviving and start living." He smiled faintly. "You sure about that?" Clara looked up at him, at the scars on his hands, the lines of exhaustion and grace on his face. "I'm sure about you." The sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the fields in honey and fire. The air smelled of wheat and rain, and for the first time, Samuel took her hand not out of gratitude, not out of fear, but out of something far deeper. Love that had grown in silence, tested by hunger and rumor, had finally found its voice. That night, after Lily was asleep, Clara stood at the window watching the moon rise. Samuel came up behind her, his hands rough against her shoulders. "You saved us," he said softly. She turned, smiling through tears. "No, Samuel. We saved each other." Outside, the fields shimmered silver in the moonlight, each stalk swaying like a promise kept. And in that quiet cabin on the edge of the Montana plains, two souls who had once met by chance now stood bound not by blood, but by choice, a choice to keep living, to keep believing, and to keep loving, even when the world said they shouldn't. Autumn came early that year. The fields turned amber, and the air smelled of apples and smoke. The valley that had once seemed like a graveyard now hummed with life. Samuel's cabin no longer felt empty. The sound of Lily's laughter echoed through the rafters, and the rhythm of Clara's footsteps became as familiar as the creak of the porch boards. Every morning, Samuel rose before dawn to chop wood, and every morning he found Clara already awake feeding the baby, humming softly to a tune that seemed older than the hills. Sometimes, when the firelight touched her hair, he caught himself wondering how something so broken could look so whole. He had started building again, not fences, not barns, but a new room onto the side of the house. For her, he said, nodding toward Lily. She'll need her own space soon. The 40. Clara smiled but said nothing. She knew it wasn't just for the child. It was for the life they were making. One evening, as the first frost glittered on the windows, Samuel came in from the fields with something hidden under his arm, a piece of smooth pine, freshly carved. He set it down on the table. Clara frowned. "What's that?" He turned it so she could see. A small cradle, shaped by hand, the name Lily Wade etched into the headboard with care. Her eyes filled before she could speak. "It's beautiful. I wasn't sure how to ask," Samuel said quietly. "But I don't want you to leave when the snows come." She looked at him across the table, the fire casting gold between them. "You're asking me to stay?" He nodded once. "Not as a guest, not as a helper, as her mother, as part of this family." The words hung in the air like a prayer finally spoken. Clara rose slowly, her fingers tracing the carved name. Lily stirred in her cradle, soft and content. "I thought I came here to save her," she whispered. "But she saved me first." "Lun." Samuel's voice was low. "Then maybe we both got saved the same way by staying." The days that followed passed in a peace neither of them had known before. The town's gossip faded like old echoes. No one came down the valley road anymore, and for once, Samuel didn't mind. He built a small fence around the orchard and planted 3 apple saplings side by side. "They'll grow strong if the roots share the same soil," he told Clara, handing her a spade. She smiled, kneeling beside him. "Just like us." Lo. Together, they buried the roots deep, covering them with earth still warm from the Sunday. When the last tree was planted, Clara brushed the dirt from her hands and looked toward the horizon. The light was turning soft, the color of honey and forgiveness. "You think they'll survive the winter?" she asked. Samuel's smile was faint but sure. "If we do." That night, after Lily had drifted to sleep, Samuel sat by the fire, carving something new from a block of maple. Clara watched quietly from her chair. "What are you making?" He didn't look up. "A sign." "For what?" He turned the wood so she could read the first letters forming, Wade and Hensley Ranch. Clara blinked, tears catching the firelight. "You mean that?" He nodded. "It's never been just mine. Not since the night you knocked on that door." She reached out, her hand resting over his. For a moment, there was only the crackle of the fire and the quiet sound of 2 hearts that had finally stopped running. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the orchard. The world felt gentler now, not because it had changed, but because they had. Weeks later, the first snow came, soft and slow. Lily toddled near the hearth, her laughter bright against the hush of the storm. Clara sat by the window, sewing a small blanket, the pattern simple but made with love. Samuel came in from the cold, his coat dusted white. "Snow's early," he said. Clara looked up and smiled. "So is peace." He crossed the room, brushed the snow from his hat, and stood behind her chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I was thinking," he said, "when spring comes, maybe we build a bigger house, with space for more than 3. She looked up at him, eyes wide, understanding dawning slow and warm. "You mean?" He nodded. "A family ought to have room to grow." Her fingers stilled over the fabric. Then she turned her face into his hand. In that small, quiet cabin at the edge of the Montana wilderness, the world outside might still whisper, still judge, but inside, something far stronger had taken root. A love born from mercy, a home built from loss, and a family held together not by blood, but by choice. Spring returned like a promise kept. The last frost melted off the fence posts, dripping into the thawing soil, and the apple saplings Samuel and Clara had planted now reached knee-high, their leaves tender and green. The wind that once howled through the valley now hummed softly, carrying the scent of new grass and sunlight. Lily, nearly 4 years old, ran barefoot across the yard, chasing a ribbon that fluttered like a bird's wing. Her laughter rose bright and pure against the quiet of the hills. Clara watched from the porch, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sunday. She called out, "Don't go too far, sweetheart." Lily turned, grinning, her curls catching the light. "Mama, look, the tree's blooming." Clara's breath caught. She rose slowly, stepping down the porch as Samuel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. Together they stood before the smallest apple tree, the one Lily had helped plant. Its branches now bore tiny white blossoms, fragile yet fierce against the wind. Samuel smiled faintly. Didn't think it'd bloom this soon. Clara looked up at him. Some things grow faster when they're loved. He slipped an arm around her shoulders, his hand resting gently over her belly. Then this land's got no chance but to flourish. They stood in silence, the sun setting low, turning the fields gold. Behind them, smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint sound of Lily's laughter mingled with the rustle of petals drifting through the air. Years from now, folks in the nearby town would still whisper about Samuel Wade and the widow who came to his door. Some said she'd saved his child. Others swore he'd saved her. But the truth was simpler and far quieter. They had both chosen to stay when leaving might have been easier. They had turned hunger into hope, shame into shelter, and grief into something that looked a lot like grace. And as long as that apple tree kept blooming each spring, their love would live on in the roots beneath it, steadfast, silent, and strong. The wind passed through the blossoms, carrying the scent of home across the prairie. And in that moment, the West felt less wild.